Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, the podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 11, and in this episode, we will be discussing how grit and resilience can help you heal trauma. How grit and resilience can help you heal trauma. And I wanted to talk about this concept of resilience especially because I feel like in our society, there tends to be this either-or approach where people tend to take extremes. And I think that's part of where some of the extremism in our society comes from as well, where people either tend to have no resilience and have what might be called learned helplessness, or people believe in victim blaming and bootstrapping. And I think both extremes are very unhealthy, very unrealistic, and not based on evidence and based on common sense, quite frankly. And so I wanted to set some of this straight about how grit and resilience can help you heal trauma. So that's what we'll be talking about in this episode. Before we get started, though, I wanted to remind you to check out the website, christianemotionalrecovery.com. That's christianemotionalrecovery.com. You can get a free resource there. You'll see it at the top of the page. Just click on that, and you can go through the steps. And the resource is an infographic that will help you to deal with difficult emotions. It's based on what's called the ACORN technique, which is an acronym for dealing with difficult emotions. Also, if you haven't, go check out the Facebook page. Every week there are new messages in terms of infographics that provide encouragement and tools and resources for healing. We have a community in there where we provide support to each other, and there is also announcements for the latest information that you can find about the platform, and that is Christian Emotional Recovery, the Facebook page. And then also check out Christian Emotional Recovery, the YouTube channel, which is fairly new, or it's gotten more active, I should say, in the last few months. There are already lots of videos that have dropped there. Things kind of like what you see on the podcast, but things you cannot get on the podcast. They are exclusive to the YouTube channel. The link is below. All of these links are below in the show notes, so check those out. And let's go ahead and jump into this episode, How Grit and Resilience Can Help You Heal Trauma. So, one reason I started this podcast to begin with was because I spent years trying to heal and nothing worked. And I would be shamed by people, sometimes well-meaning, sometimes not well-meaning, that I was being punished for sinning. I don't think those people were well-meaning most of the time, maybe in their own way, but that was not even then a very good thing to say to somebody who was experiencing shame and depression and anxiety because of trauma and abuse that was no fault of their own, and then turn around and victim blame. That's pretty messed up. But I was also told things like, maybe I couldn't heal, it just wasn't possible, maybe I should pray harder, I don't have enough faith, maybe it wasn't God's will for me to heal. I heard all kinds of messed up things. And I got so frustrated. I tried everything. I read self-help books. I prayed. I meditated. I read scripture. I did positive affirmations, and nothing worked. I just kept going through this cycle of negative thinking and hurt and anger and shame and self-hatred, and nothing worked. And I felt like there was something wrong with me. Another one I heard was, oh, you were probably born that way. You probably are just prone to mental illness. Again, I do believe that some people may have more inclination towards depression, anxiety, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and all kinds of conditions, but trauma is not inherited in terms of genetics. Now, there is proof that generational trauma can come through genetics, but it's not genetic itself. Does that make sense? It's not in your DNA by God's design. It happened from experience passed down the family line. The point is, I was not born that way. I wasn't deficient. There was nothing wrong with me. And the same is true for you. I'll say it again. You were not born that way. You were not deficient. There is nothing wrong with you. And you can heal. And so these experiences are damaging and re-traumatizing. When people say things like that, don't say things like that to people. It's one thing to say, I'll pray for you, or I'm not saying you can't suggest prayer. That's not what I'm saying, anything like that. But I'm saying that when somebody gives that as a catch-all, blanket, umbrella response to somebody's entire existence being traumatized and nothing working, that is a damaging thing to say. So if this has happened to you, there is nothing wrong with you because you haven't been able to heal. And trauma is unique, and it requires specific knowledge and strategies to heal. And it's amazing how many people still don't know or understand what's going on when these things happen. I'm not blaming those people, but who I am blaming is the people who don't know that and then turn around and act like they do know things by quoting scripture at you. It's different to say a scripture as a word of comfort. That's different than quoting scripture at somebody. And I'll just be blunt. I was in a lot of Christian groups on Facebook, and I left a lot of those groups because I got tired of the self-righteous people preaching to people without any compassion. If somebody doesn't know how to show compassion, to listen, to try to understand, to try to educate themselves, then they should just sit down and shut up. That's probably controversial, but I'm just going to say it. They should just sit down and shut up. God does not want us hurting people and re-traumatizing them. Now, it's one thing to tell people the truth in kindness, but these people, that's what they thought they were doing, but they were not doing it with any compassion. And if it's devoid of compassion and it's patronizing, it is not in kindness. So I also got tired of people saying Christians can't go to therapy, Christians can't meditate, Christians can't do this, Christians can't do that, without any convincing explanations of why other than sweeping generalizations. I do want to say one thing. We are called to use discernment. And I'm not saying that because that you have to do any of the things that I mentioned. I'm simply talking about generalizations where somebody would take their opinion or their interpretation and force it on people as an absolute overall with no openness to any conversation, any debate, any discussion, nothing. It was just, this is what it is, the truth, and there was no truth proof of that, if that makes sense. So that's all I'm saying. This is just my opinion. I could be wrong about any of it, but I believe that those kinds of things, when done in the wrong context, can be damaging. So I would hear about how a specific therapy helped someone and wondered why people were being helped by these therapies, but I was hearing those messages. And I realized that Christian community especially needed to learn about therapies that would heal trauma, and that God gave us these modalities to heal trauma as a gift. If we have trauma and it's destroying our lives, and there are methods that can heal us, as long as they don't directly go against God, why would those exist and then God tell us that we can't use them and we must therefore stay stuck in trauma? That makes absolutely no sense. And so this channel was born. And so things like depression, anxiety, and similar forms of mental health issues are at an all-time high in our society. And the younger generation, the younger the generation, the worse it seems to get. In other words, mental health, as you go down from baby boomer to Gen X to millennial to Gen Z and so on, the further down the line you go, there seems to be a growing body of evidence, and just anecdotally, people you know from each of those generations, there seem to be more mental health problems the further down we go in the generation cycle. And I don't think it's because Gen Y or Gen Z or millennials are deficient compared to baby boomers. And I don't think it's because baby boomers are better. I think that all generations have their strengths and weaknesses, and I think we're all equally valuable and capable innately before God. And that's not what's going on here. It's not like there's something in the water, okay? Now, we do have more chemicals in our environment, we have more estrogens, and we have more things like that that could affect certain qualities of personality. But overall, I believe that qualities of character from one generation to the next, the innate ability to have those is the same in every generation. So what's happening here? Why is there more depression, more anxiety, more eating disorders, more confusion about identity in the later generations compared to the earlier generations? Well, I believe some of it is, there's a lot of reasons for that. But, I don't have all the answers. I'm not an expert, so take what I say here with a grain of salt. But here are a few reasons that I've read about, I've witnessed in my own life, and I've heard the wisdom of older generations talking about this, as well as the wisdom of the younger generations themselves talk about this. And some of them are social isolation due to phones and social media, which leads into lack of community and interpersonal relationships and connections. And the proof of this is if you go to indigenous tribes where they still have stronger village and family connections, their psychological well-being is much better, and certain types of things like inferiority complexes, they don't even know what those are. Like, it's not even a thing. And so one time somebody questioned, I think it was the Dalai Lama, and they were talking about this concept of I don't feel good enough. And he would be like, what are you talking about? And they would try to explain it to him like 5 different ways. And the Dalai Lama literally did not understand the concept of unworthiness. It was very strange because we are so immersed in that concept in Western society. But a few more reasons why there are probably more mental health issues, and we're leading into resilience talking about this. Also, younger generations are not taught grit and resilience. Some of it is because our society, we faced challenges, but like the World War II generation, they learned grit and resilience on the go because the situation required it. And younger generations are often not taught grit and resilience, such as learning from their mistakes, not always being rescued, or having everything done for them. For example, when I was a kid, our parents would throw us out of the house and say, don't come back until the streetlights came on, right? If you grew up in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, early 90s, and now, somebody can get reported for child abuse because they let their kid walk 2 blocks to school, or they let them go play in the park across the street while mom goes to the store for 10 minutes. I mean, it's insane how ridiculous things have gotten, and I'm not going to get into politics or anything like that. I don't do that on this channel, and all people are welcome on this channel, but my point is that some of it is helicopter parenting. I'm not going to condemn parenting styles either. I think that there's a range, and every child is different and every parent is different. But my point is that resilience and grit are just not qualities that are taught as much in the younger generation. Again, there are exceptions. There are still parents that teach their kids this, that give them some freedom, that allow them to learn from their mistakes, that teach them personal responsibility, and while at the same time teaching them love and showing them compassion and validating their emotions. But as a general rule, that's not taught anymore. I case in point, I know people that, case in point, in this neighborhood, there are kids. This is a residential neighborhood. The speed limit on these streets is 25 miles an hour. And there are kids here that will ride four-wheelers. They're super loud, super obnoxious. They make your windows rattle. And I'm not against four-wheelers or four-wheeler riding, but in a residential neighborhood, it's obnoxious. And if a kid goes up and down the street for an hour or two, every once in a while, it's no big deal. But there are people whose kids would just ride and ride and ride for hours on end, and somebody would complain about it, and somebody would be like, oh, they're kids, they would be like, they're riding through my yard, and they'd be like, oh, kids, let them be kids, leave them alone. I had such a hard life. I want my kids to have a better life than I did. But what they're not realizing is they're not teaching them manners and accountability and consideration of other people and consequences for certain kinds of actions. And so it raises a generation of narcissists and codependents and people that can't, learn and be courteous and be resilient in our society. And that can be a problem. And I see that all over the place, like no boundaries. Any kind of boundary is child abuse. It's ridiculous. But there's a lot of reasons why resilience seems to have gone down over time, but those are a few of the reasons. And the terms personal accountability and personal responsibility. So I want to talk about how when people take extremes either way, it's not healthy. And the term personal accountability and personal responsibility are both legitimate terms, and we are called by God to have those, and I agree with that. But I don't use those terms a lot on my channel or my platform, because those can be triggering for people who are recovering from trauma. And, I don't do trigger warnings or anything like that on this channel unless maybe it involves something really hardcore, like certain types of violence or sexual exploitation or something like that. But I still like to use terms that are approachable to people on the channel so that they can digest the material in a way where they're open to it and they can learn from it and they feel comfortable and confident with the terminology. And so that's just why I don't use those a lot, even though I do still believe in those concepts. I hope that makes sense. I try to run this channel with honesty and bluntness, but at the same time, a certain level of trauma-informed awareness and sensitivity. So while this channel is about healing trauma, to do the healing work in itself requires grit and resilience. I don't beat around the bush, I tell the truth. And the work itself also builds grit and resilience. And I've told you, I'll tell you once, I'll tell you twice, and I tell this to myself all the time too. So I'm not just saying it at you, I'm telling myself this at the same time. You cannot heal from trauma if you're not willing to do the work. And the work is hard, and it's difficult, and you have to come back at it day after day after day. It ain't for the faint of heart, and that sucks, and it's not fair because the trauma that you have now is not who you are, and you did not cause it in most cases. And so it sucks that you have to do all this extra work that other people don't have to do, but there it is. That's the reality, and that's how you heal. And I try to be thankful for the fact, and this is me, again, I'm not trying to bypass you, but I try to be thankful for the fact that I can heal, and that I have found what over time I was trying to heal and I couldn't, but now I found a path where I can. That's a smoking gun. That's wonderful, and I'm so grateful for that. But so when it comes to, you have to do the work. But at the same time, I also want to make a point about the fact that not everybody is in the same position. Some people have it easier than others, and some people have it harder. Again, it's not fair, but that's how it does happen. There are obvious and real systemic inequities in our society, such as poverty, racism, sexism, etc. And those are real experiences that can contribute to trauma in society and based on individual experience. But many people will focus on these exclusively without considering personal growth, personal power, and personal agency as well. If someone has experienced adverse circumstances, those are valid, and they should be validated and addressed at the root for the individual and within society. However, it can't stop there. We need to teach children and adults grit and resilience in society, even in and in spite of adverse circumstances. This isn't heartless, it's actually compassionate. If you teach somebody helplessness, you're not doing them any favors. It teaches human beings their worth and then their innate abilities regardless of who they are and through who they are. Teaching someone to be helpless does nothing for them. There is actually a term called learned helplessness. It's an actual term that has been researched and proven to be a thing, so to speak. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So I want to talk about it from the other end too. And, I hope that this platform is followed by people from all over the world. I am American, so I do talk about the United States and certain things that are going on here a lot, so bear with me. But especially in the U.S. and among older generations, not all, but a lot, people didn't like to talk about emotional issues. And there was and still is among many, you may have parents or grandparents that are or were this way, a bootstrap, I use that in quotes, mentality. And bootstrap basically means that if you're having a problem, you don't ask for help, you don't talk about it, you don't complain, you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you get over it, you move on, and you just, that's what you do. And you find a way. But that's not always possible. And this is the other extreme that is also toxic and traumatizing. Both extremes are not healthy or realistic. There is a balance in the middle where we can teach trauma-informed compassion along with resilience and grit, as well as a growth mindset, which to me are better terms than your responsibility, that help you arrive at the same destination, even though that is what we're talking about here. So basically what I mean there is having grit and resilience and a growth mindset is a more positive, constructive, and approachable way to take responsibility for your trauma. Because, like I said, that starts to sound a little bit almost like blame. It isn't. But if you are in trauma, it's going to feel that way. You know how I know? Because I've been there. And it's like, it's not fair. I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I'm not perfect. I'm not without mistakes. Of course, I've done bad and wrong things through my trauma and because of them. But what I'm saying is it makes it sound like where you're at is your fault and all the pain you're going through is your fault. And it's not. It's not. And so if there's a more constructive way to arrive at the same destination without guilt and condemnation, then do it, and so that's why my style here is more compassionate, because that's why. And I remember hearing that healing was, quote, your responsibility, and I also heard it so many times I got sick of it. And it became a triggering term for me, at least. And like I said, I don't want that to become one for you if it's not, because I know there are certain phrases that trigger other people that don't trigger me. For example, the term, it is what it is. I know people that hate that term. For me, it's kind of comforting. So, you have to figure out your own self. But you get what I'm saying. So many self-help books and people victim blame. I went through the whole positive psychology thing. Now, positive psychology in itself is not bad. There are good things in there, and I'm going to get to those in a few minutes. But the ones I'm talking about are think positively, and positive things will happen. Law of attraction, like if you think good things, then good things will happen in your life. And if good things aren't happening, then it's your fault. Many self-help books and people would victim blame in that way. If you have trauma, it doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. I tried really hard to do that for all this time. And again, it was another way to re-traumatize me. And I went through this cycle for decades, not knowing what was wrong with me. I got a little bit better and healed a little bit with those strategies, but they didn't do much for me. And I'm not saying they don't do anything for anybody, but for people with trauma, and for me particular, it did not help. I tried really hard not to do that here. I don't victim blame. I don't use bypassing. I don't use toxic positivity. All of that, in my opinion, is a bunch of crap. It's a bunch of crap. And additionally, like I said, the law of attraction teachers will teach you that if you're not on cloud nine 100% of the time, there's something wrong with you. Well, guess what? There's not. And that's a bunch of crap too. And that traumatized me and re-traumatized me, and I kept trying real hard to make that philosophy fit my life, and no matter what I did, it didn't. And I'm not going to say there's no such thing as law of attraction. I do believe that. I don't know if it's an energy field or, it's a law that God put into motion or what. I do believe that your thoughts do have power in the sense of the direction your life goes in. If you just observe the people around you, people that are genuinely, from the core, not fake, genuinely optimistic, genuinely positive, genuinely resilient, those people tend to land on their feet more. Things seem to work out for them. There's truth to that. But you can't come at this with that mindset because it doesn't work for people who have suffered from trauma. So I'll say it again. Many law of attraction teachers will teach you that if you're not on cloud nine 100% of the time, there's something wrong with you. There is not. Or if you've done law of attraction work for 10, 20, 30 years, I wasted so much of my life on that garbage too. And I shouldn't call it garbage. There are people I know that it has helped, but I believe personally in the power of God. And I believe that God can use the laws of the universe as tools that we can harness. But you're not going to feel great all the time. That's just not realistic, especially if you live in trauma. You're not supposed to feel great all the time. That's not life. And that's okay. That's the thing. We condemn people if we have this thing about pursuing happiness to the point that if you're not happy most or all of the time, there's something wrong with you. And for the first time in my life, I feel like it's okay not to be happy all the time or to try to be happy all the time because I'm okay with who I am and I'm okay with where I'm at to enough degree that I have peace inside of myself. And that's something you get as you heal trauma, that peace that passes understanding. Peace that passes understanding means that I'm okay when I'm up, I'm okay when I'm down. It doesn't mean it's great when you're down. It doesn't mean it feels good when you're down. It doesn't mean you don't want things to be better when you're down. But you see what I'm saying. I've also heard a lot of Christian teachers in hardcore type denominations say that God doesn't care about our happiness. So the other extreme again, right? And while there are other concerns that can be more important a good bit of the time than our happiness, like loving other people, the state of our soul, our salvation, I also think that it takes things to an extreme as well to say that. I do believe God cares about the state of our souls most of all, but He also cares about us and our lives. And He did say that He came here that we may have life and have it in abundance. And all is well with my soul, I don't think that just means where you're going to go when you die. I think it also means your inner being, your wellness, your body, your mind, and your soul combined, the state of your life, your personal character, your emotional state. All of those things can be considered your soul. Pursuing happiness, though, for its own sake will not bring happiness. Ouch, right? I thought for the longest time that was true. It is not true. I'll say it again. Pursuing happiness for its own sake will not bring happiness. Sometimes life feels like a slippery, wriggling fish that we can't get our hands on, right? It sucks. And if you suffer from trauma and you chase after the wind, like the Bible talks about in, I think it's Ecclesiastes, chasing after the wind, that's kind of true. And that's why you need to work on things that are internal and eternal. And that's where happiness comes from. It's almost like a slow burn that lasts a long time instead of a flame that flares up and then dies out. Kind of like a good marriage, the chemistry in a good marriage. But if you work on personal healing and growth and build a genuine relationship with God and serve God as your priorities, the other stuff does work itself out in time. I know, I get tired of hearing that too, but that's one that's actually kind of true, especially when you focus on the concepts themselves instead of the outcome, and that's tricky when you're being tormented emotionally. But the more you go back and focus on the work, Focus on the work. Focus on the work. It does come into being more and more. There's a concept called learned helplessness that I mentioned a little bit ago, and I wanted to talk about that here, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to mention that learned helplessness is the opposite of that. And we'll talk about that because in order to know what to do, you need to know what not to do as well. So we'll come back to that. But I wanted first to talk about grit and resilience. The definition of grit is courage and resolve, strength of character. I love that. Courage and resolve, strength of character. Now, for resilience, I got two definitions because I wanted to note the differences and show you why the definition of the second one is better, especially for trauma survivors. The first one is, quote, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. The capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. That's all good and fine, and that's pretty much the definition you would probably expect. But the first one comes from the dictionary. And if you've suffered from a lot of trauma and you have a lot of emotional issues and you have anxiety and you have depression and stuff like that, that might seem like something you just can't do. It may seem impossible. So let me give you another definition. This one comes from the American Psychological Association, the APA, and it is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult and challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external demands. I'll say it again. The process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult and challenging life experience, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to internal and external demands. That one, even though it sounds tough, sounds more like something that you could do. And the reason for that is because I think when you adjust the language to be more sensitive and kindly based, just making it where it's more approachable and making the definition easier to understand where it relates to you, it becomes possible. And this definition comes from an article called Building Your Resilience, and the only author I could find was the APA. Building Your Resilience, the American Psychological Association. And this definition is trauma-informed. It's trauma-informed. The first one is not. The first one would probably trigger a trauma survivor, maybe not, because they would feel like they couldn't do it. But the second one implies it's a skill that can be learned. I'll say it again. The second one implies it's a skill that can be learned. You know why? Because it is. It is. I'll say it again. Resilience is a skill that you can learn. As always, keep in mind that all the articles I reference are in the show notes, so check out below if I reference any article here, whether I read from it or use it or I just mention it, it will be in the show notes below, so check those out. Now, in the American Psychological Association article, it is called Building Your Resilience. I want to read a paragraph from it to show you why resilience is trauma-informed. Why this definition is trauma-informed and why you can learn resilience. So that's, I want to remind you that the name of this group even is Christian Emotional Recovery. Emotional recovery. The word recovery wouldn't be in there, and that's why this group is called Recovery, because it can be learned. It can be done. So resilience and recovery can be cultivated. All of those can be learned and cultivated. Let me read that article paragraph. Like building a muscle, increasing your resilience takes time and intentionality. So, my words, you do it a little bit at a time. The article. Focusing on 4 core components, connection, wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning, can empower you to withstand and learn from difficult and traumatic experiences. To increase your capacity for resilience to weather and grow from the difficulties, use these strategies. And so I'll put the article in there so you can see those strategies and read them in detail. So this concept is based on research, and it's also, like I said, something that you can learn. And there are 4 components that this article talks about, and they are building connections and prioritizing relationships. For example, joining a group, Also, fostering wellness, take care of your body, practice mindfulness, avoid negative outlets, for example, coping mechanisms that are not healthy, binging, things like that. Find purpose is the other one. You can do that by helping others, being proactive, moving towards your goals, looking for opportunities for self-discovery, the growth work that I talk about all the time. And what I'm doing here with this podcast is a form of that. It helps me. So I'm thankful for you because it's great to be needed and wanted and to be able to do something with your experiences that can help people. There's no greater feeling in the world. The next one, embrace healthy thoughts, keep things in perspective, accept change, maintain a hopeful outlook, and learn from your past. Seeking help is another one. For example, getting help from a licensed professional or therapist. Seeking out a doctor to see what you can do about the physical side of things with a health regimen and maybe medication if it's needed. All of those things. So you can read that article, Building Your Resilience by the American Psychological Association. And so let's talk about learned helplessness. What is that? And what does it have to do with trauma? And there's an article in Very Well Mind. I use that website a lot. It's a great website because it puts things in layman's terms. And it's by Kendra Cherry, and it's an article called What is Learned Helplessness and Why Does It Happen? And years ago, I read a book by a psychologist, a psychotherapist named Martin Seligman, Seligman. And this book stuck out to me. Like, I remember it so well, even though I read this a long time ago before I was trauma informed. And then, so this concept of learned helplessness is based on research. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about what is learned helplessness. Why is it significant and so on? Why am I talking about this here? So, learned helplessness is the following. When people feel that they have no control over their situation, they may begin to behave in a helpless manner. This inaction can lead people to overlook opportunities for relief or change. So that's basically what learned helplessness is. When people feel they have no control over their situation, they may begin to behave in a helpless manner. This inaction can lead people to overlook opportunities for relief or change. And if you're in a trauma, survival, fight or flight situation, you're either disassociated or you're always on high alert and in fight or flight, you're not going to be able to think in terms of resilience. You will be in a state of learned helplessness in a lot of ways. And so I want you to understand this concept a little bit more. So learned helplessness was discovered, it's always been there, it's just something that we learned to understand, by Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer. And now, let me make a note about this. They experimented on dogs, okay? I'm not cool with that. I'm not okay with that. They shocked dogs, okay? That is messed up. But nevertheless, we can't change what they did. The research has been done. But the concept of learned helplessness was discovered accidentally by these two psychologists. They had initially observed helpless behavior in dogs that were classically conditioned to expect an electric shock after hearing a tone. Later, the dogs were placed in a shuttle box, I'm not sure what that is, that contained two chambers separated by a low barrier. The floor was electrified on one side and not on the other. The dogs previously subjected to classical conditioning made no attempts to escape, even though avoiding the shock simply involved jumping over a small barrier. To investigate the phenomenon, they devised another experiment. In one group, the dogs were strapped into a harness for a period of time and then released. In group 2, the dogs were placed in the same harnesses but were subjected to electrical shocks, I hate that could be avoided by pressing a panel with their noses. In group 3, the dogs received the same shocks as those in group 2, except those in this group were not able to control the shock. For the dogs in the third group, the shocks seemed to be completely random and outside of their control. The dogs were then placed in a shuttle box. Dogs from the first and second groups quickly learned that jumping over the barrier eliminated the shock, so they got away from it. Those from the third group, however, made no attempts to get away from the shocks. They learned helplessness. Due to the previous experience, they had developed a cognitive expectation that nothing they did would prevent or eliminate their shocks. That's what happens to us when we experience trauma or abuse over and over and over again. And while what these guys did to these dogs is sadistic, and most of us do not approve of it, we do understand what this means and what the concept behind it is. And so if you've experienced abuse or trauma and you're in a state of learned helplessness, it is not your fault. It is absolutely not your fault. Let me go on and read a little bit about learned helplessness in humans. It says, the impact of learned helplessness has been demonstrated in different animal species, but its effects can also be seen in people. One quick note, I read a little bit more about Seligman's experiments, and just to redeem him a little bit, I am not condoning what he did at all. But he did try to minimize his research in terms of the amount of suffering. He only did it if he felt like it could benefit dogs and humans. And so after this, he wondered, what can I do to teach these dogs to learn how to avoid the shocks again so that they're no longer learned helpless, right? So he did find a way to do that, and I will put that article in the show notes as well, even though I'm not going to directly reference or use it here. But if you're interested, you can go there and find it, and it's an article called... It's in the New Yorker, and it's called Trying to Cure Depression but Inspiring Torture. I know, awful, right? But you can check that out if you're interested in finding out more about Seligman's research and the fact that he kind of redeemed himself, by helping these dogs overcome what they had started. Also proving that you can overcome learned helplessness, even if you're conditioned to it very strongly. You can overcome it. So, learned helplessness... in humans, a child, for example, I'm just going to reference it here instead of reading it, who performs poorly on math tests and assignments will quickly begin to feel that nothing she does will have any effect on her math performance. But later faces any type of math-related task, they may experience a sense of helplessness. So here it says, learned helplessness has also been associated with several different psychological disorders. Depression, anxiety, phobias, shyness, and loneliness can all be exacerbated by learning helplessness. I don't think all of those are disorders, and I don't think they're all weaknesses. I think that they're just things that people happen to have because they've had adverse experiences. But we can do things about some of those conditions as well. So, learned helplessness in children, it talks about that as well. And I wanted to make a note here. If you were raised by people who were this way themselves, they were abusive or negligent, or they were unresponsive, that can contribute to those feelings. And that's learned, it can begin very early in life. And if that's all you've known, even more so, you're going to feel like you can't overcome it because that's all you've known. How would you think that you can overcome something if you've never seen or experienced anything else? And I will tell you, that's how I grew up. And I can tell you again, yes, you can overcome it. It's hard and it takes time, but you can overcome it. Children raised in these kinds of settings can learn. You learn from mentors. You learn from these teachings. You learn by educating and empowering yourself and use the strategies I'm mentioning here in this particular podcast and the others, and from other teachers. So keep in mind that even if you learned it in childhood because you were immersed in it, you can still unlearn it, and you can still learn resilience, which is the opposite of learned helplessness. So keep that in mind. And then there's a bit about overcoming it. And the article says, research suggests that learned helplessness can be successfully decreased, particularly if intervention occurs during early onset. Long-term learned helplessness can also be reduced, although it may require longer-term effort. Therapy can be effective. It talks about cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not going to go into detail there. You can read that, but I'm also giving you some strategies here that I think will work even better, because research has actually shown that overcoming trauma, which is associated with learned helplessness, doing the body work and focusing on the trauma itself, not dwelling on it, but dealing with it, is more helpful. So I just wanted to talk about learned helplessness because it's the opposite of resilience. And you need to understand the opposite of resilience if you're going to overcome and become resilient, right? So there is a book by Martin Seligman. Like I said, I read it years ago, and it's called Learned Optimism. I'll put it in the show notes if you're interested. And it basically talks about how optimism and positivity, not in a fake way, but in a real way, is a strength and a skill that you can cultivate. Now, that sounds contradictory from what I said before, because I tried all the positive thinking, the power of positive thinking with Norman Vincent Peale, positive psychology books like Tony Robbins, and the stuff helped me a little. It did. But it did not get rid of my trauma. You have to start with the trauma, and you have to work at the roots of the trauma. And once you start doing that, some of this other stuff may begin to help you more. And also, if you're coming at it from a trauma-informed mindset, and you keep that in mind in your actual practice, then it can help. And learned optimism is also getting to the root of your thoughts. And you need to get to the root of your thoughts and the trauma that's in your body at the same time, but especially the trauma that's in your body. So the learned optimism can be very helpful. It's just a different kind of therapy. But there's one other thing I wanted to make a note of as well here, because I tell you that I teach things in balance. I don't believe in condemnation. So I wanted to make a note about something called the spoon theory. Have you ever heard of the spoon theory? And it's about how there are real limits to what we can do, especially if we deal with trauma, burnout, sensitivity, and or chronic illness. So I just wanted to make a note that when I talk about you can overcome this stuff, I'm not trying to shame you if you do have limitations based on chronic health issues or a disability. Again, like I said, there are real systemic issues in our society, and there are real issues, personal issues that people have that can make things very difficult, and I'm not going to deny or bypass those. But there was something called the spoon theory by Christine Miserandino, and it's a classic article that's gone all over the internet over the years. And I'm not going to read the whole article, but I want you to read this article because it does give you a different perspective. It's not to help you to learn helplessness. It's also not an excuse not to try or not to do anything, but there are people who have real limitations, and so none of this is meant to invalidate your experience. I understand having a limited amount of resources and energy you can have each day, and that's basically what the spoon theory is. The spoon theory is that not everybody has the same resources, and not everybody has the same amount of energy and ability in terms of physical ability. The ability to be resilient is something we all possess, but we may possess it in different amounts on different days and in different amounts in general, and that's okay. So the spoon theory is just that some people may have 12 spoons in one day, and getting a shower is one spoon, right? Other people may have 37 spoons in a day, and feeding their dog, getting a shower, and sweeping the floor is one spoon. You get what I'm saying. You get the idea. But I just wanted to mention that I don't victim blame, and that I understand that limitations are a real thing, but it's not the only part of the story. You also have a lot of power here. So how do I know when to push or not to push? When do I push towards resilience, and when am I being too hard on myself? That is not something I can answer for you. And I know it sucks. You probably want me to give you a neat little answer tied in a bow. And I can't, nor will I do that, because everybody's different. And that's something you learn more with practice. I wish I could give you a simpler answer, but it's important to take care of yourself while also doing the healing work. That I can tell you. Resilience is learned gradually, over time, gently with yourself, pushing forward gently, not by forcing or being harsh with yourself. It's learned by self-compassion and focused work over time. And another thing to consider is trying again is resilience, yes, but trying again in the same ways that have failed dozens of times is not resilience. You've heard that that's the definition of madness. It's what resilience is about growth and learning. So it's not just trying again, but applying what you've learned to do it in a way that makes sense. It's about strategy and how you do it too, and using common sense and experience and wisdom to do that. The Bible is all about wisdom. So that's one part of resilience too, is learning and using wisdom. You learn from previous experience and apply what you have learned. And this is the difference between what some call madness, like I said, and resilience. There's a modicum of sense and learning involved. And there's something here that I wanted to go into next called the trauma resiliency model. So we've talked about learned helplessness. We've talked about what resilience is and what it is not. So I wanted to talk about what are some things I can do to actually build resilience. What does that mean? So there's actually a research-based model called the trauma resiliency model, and it's a bottom-up approach. You know how I've talked about we have been doing all of this wrong, and I'll say wrong, with our healing work with trauma. Like I said, the reason praying doesn't work is because it's a top-down approach. Praying alone doesn't work, I should say. Praying does work, but just praying alone very rarely heals trauma. And just therapy where you talk about your problems or write them out in a journal, it helps you feel better, but it does not get to the root of your trauma because it's top down. When it comes to trauma, you have to work from the bottom up. You work with the body, for example. And so there's an article, and I'm not going to read it, but if you want to learn more, just to prove this is based in research and resilience, trauma healing through resilience, starting from the bottom up, is also based in research. There's an article by Linda Grab and Eleanor Miller Karras, but it's called The Trauma Resiliency Model, a bottom-up intervention for trauma psychotherapy. And it's the science of resiliency to heal trauma. So if you want to get into the technical aspects of it, I'm not going to go into them here, but you can. I'm a research person. I teach English, I teach research, I teach critical thinking. So I wanted to show you some of the research, and if you're interested, you can read that article. I'll put it in the show notes. It's called The Trauma Resiliency Model, a bottom-up intervention for trauma psychotherapy. Now, let's talk about it on a more approachable layman's level here. So this trauma resiliency model is based in research, and it's been used all over the place, and it's been proven to work, and it's basically body somatic therapies to help you build resistance. And there's another article called Trauma Resiliency Model, Why Trauma Rehab Therapy Might Be Right for You. That article is a little more approachable. It's by somebody called the Dawn Rehab, D-A-W-N. And I just wanted to read those approaches real quick so you can know some specific strategies that will help you to learn trauma resilience. So what are some ways you can learn specific types of resilience? So let's talk about 9 ways that you can apply resilience by using this resiliency model. So the trauma resiliency model is a model based on body therapy and the physical effects of stress caused by traumatic events, working with those from the body. So in other words, it's working with trauma in the body where it resides at its root. And that allows you, through specific concrete practices, to get that to come up and out of your neural network and express itself, because trauma is nothing but energy and stress that has never been discharged from the body, extreme stress. And this helps you to get that to come out of your body, but it also teaches you to reconnect with the positive aspects of yourself and of the world around you and of God and of life. And so 9 resiliency skills are tracking, and that's to accurately gauge one's own senses and bodily responses in real time. So do some research on these strategies and practice them. There's all kinds of free videos on YouTube. There's articles, there's courses, there's books. So do some of these practices and they'll help you. Resourcing is number 2, and that's to build a working memory of safe, comfortable, or happy feelings and ideas which can be called upon to provide refuge during tense moments. Another way to build resilience, 3, is grounding, to reconnect the body physically with the safety of its immediate surroundings. Gesturing is another one, and that's to develop a set of calming physical movements. Examples would be stretching, yoga. You have to do your discernment on that one. Help now is number 5, to train the body to relocate its resources of resiliency. Number 6 is shift and stay, to move away from difficult sensations and toward physical wellness. Notice it doesn't say force. It says shift and stay, if you can, to move away from difficult sensations and towards physical wellness, or I would say feelings of wholeness and safety. Titration is number 7. Titration, that's Titration, to gently and gradually desensitize clients to stressful stimuli. So that's going back and forth gradually between the feelings in your body of trauma and difficult emotions and coming out of them and in of them and out of them. Not constantly, but a little bit at a time with each. And the acorn meditation and technique that I have you do, that's sort of a form of titration because you do it gradually over time. But I don't have you come in and out. I just have you go into it for a little bit. And then when you do it later, you go into it a little bit. And when you're not in it, you're not in it. So it's in and out like that. Pendulation is similar, but not exactly the same thing. That's number 8. Pendulation, and that's the guide to guide the client between feelings of trauma and safety like a controlled pendulum. The feeling of trauma and safety, trauma and safety, trauma and safety. So one is more like desensitization by gently feeling the emotion in your body in a safe environment. And the other one is kind of going back and forth within the same meditation or practice, whatever kind of practice you might be doing, even if it's therapy. Some of these I would be very careful with and only do them with a professional at first. And then as you get more control and as you get more experience, you can do them on your own. Number 9 is completion, and that's to allow the client to act out their natural stress responses within a safe environment. Especially that one, be really careful and do that one with a professional at first. But this article has pictures and gives you a way to use these different 9 therapies. And then it just goes into more detail of how they treat people and how TRM has been successful, and that even if you have an adverse childhood high ACEs score, which is adverse childhood experience, also based in research, it's a model that's time tested, that you can still learn resilience and you can still get better and heal. Okay? So that's a little bit about that model and the 9 ways that you can use the trauma resiliency model. So do research on those practices. And that's why trauma-informed resilience is so important, because it's research-based and it works. So between learned optimism, mind work, trauma recovery model using body work, and a combination of body and mind work, it can help you to heal trauma. And I'll include all these resources in the show notes to give you terms you can do further research on. In those articles, go back and look at those terms, go back and look at those strategies, and you can do further research and look at the links in the articles as well. One thing I teach my students is if you go to the references at the bottom of the page, there'll be other articles, and if something catches your eye, follow through on it. Follow that trail of breadcrumbs to the next thing, and you'll often find yourself going on a journey of discovery where you can find your own answers with God's help. Also, the point of this episode, like I said though, finishing up here, is to show you a more nuanced approach to life and healing trauma. It requires grit and resilience, but it also needs compassion, sensitivity, education, and work. And that's why healing trauma can be tricky, like trying to hold that wriggly, wet fish. It also is healing trauma, optimism, and resilience, and those can be learned. I'll say it again. Healing trauma, optimism, and resilience, when they're authentic, can be learned. And if you learn them, they are authentic. It's not, you were born this way. You had a rough childhood. Tough luck. You are not stuck. You can learn to heal. You can learn resiliency, and you can start to feel better. So don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And so one article that I wanted to leave you with at the end of this podcast is from the Harvard Business Review. And it actually gives you a step-by-step process based on clinical research called Growth After Trauma. And this is what it's all about. Like I said, resilience isn't just getting up and trying again. It's applying your previous experience and the wisdom you learned from those experiences to know how to do that. Okay? And that's why I give you these strategies, so you do have some ways to know how. And this is by Richard G. Tedeschi, I think. And these are the steps you'll go through as you start healing and become more resilient. Note, though, there's a list of steps here that are sequential, but note that you don't necessarily go through those linearly. You may go back and forth and in and out of those at different times, but you will do later steps increasingly as you heal. But let me just really quickly give you some steps here. Growth after trauma. I'll put this in the show notes. There's even a way you can listen to this article if you want. But the elements of growth, 5 ways, are education, emotional regulation. So these aren't necessarily sequential, but they are to a point. Emotional regulation, disclosure, that's where you talk about and share with people who are worthy and in safe spaces your experience with people. Disclosure, narrative development. So that's where you start to work on developing an authentic narrative about trauma and accepting what's happened and being able to share that without shame. And then service. And that's where you take your experiences and help other people. That doesn't necessarily mean you teach about trauma. It could be any number of things. It could be being a sponsor in an AA meeting. It could be being a worship leader at your church and taking your experiences and letting your experience help you be compassionate in how you relate to people in a trauma-informed way. It could be writing poetry that touches people's hearts. There's a million things. Being a teacher. It could be just being the kind of human being you wish other people were when you're around other people wherever you're at. And so that's a little bit about resilience, and that's a little bit about how you can apply grit and resilience to heal trauma. And thank you so much for listening to this podcast. This was episode 11, season 2. And this is, I think, an important thing that we need to talk about. And I think we need more trauma-informed people, and I'm spreading the message. That's my purpose in life. That's what God has called me to do. And so I thank you for listening, and thank you so much for giving me your time. Check out the podcast, Christian Emotional Recovery, linked in the show notes below. Check out the YouTube video where you can get teachings that are not like this one, exclusive to the YouTube channel. And it's Christian Emotional Recovery, the YouTube channel, also linked in the show notes. And check out the Christian Emotional Recovery group, Facebook group, also called Christian Emotional Recovery, linked below. Check out the webpage with the free resource, christianemotionalrecovery.com. Thank you so much. Remember that trauma is not your fault. You can heal. You can learn resilience. You can learn trauma healing and recovery. God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.